Hello everyone. In this video, let's practice with cin, cout, if statements by coding the following problem. So it says write a program that inputs three integers from the keyboard and prints the sum, average, product, smallest, and largest of these numbers. So let's get started. So when we first launch Visual Studio, so we want to create a new project, empty project, and then here you select the path where you want to save it. I'm going to save it in my download area. I created a folder called CPP. So let's call it three integers. Then click create. And then after this, we want to create a source file. Click add, new item, and then choose CPP file. And we can call it anything we want. Let's call it main. Then click add. And now we can start writing our code. So let's include some libraries. Include the IOStream. Then we're going to use using namespace std. So we don't have to write std : every time we write cin or cout. So for this program, to find the smallest and the largest, we're not gonna use any built-in functions. So we're gonna try to do it without using any built-in functions like the min, the max, or any other functions in C++. So let's get started. First, we want to introduce three variables of type integers. So let's call them int, num1, num2, and num3. And now we want to ask the user to enter three integers. So we use cout, and then in between double quotation, we write enter three integers. And then we give it one space. And then to save these integers in num1, num2, and num3, we're going to use cin. So to save the first integer, the user enter in num1, we write num1. Then the second integer, to save it in num2, we write num2. And then for the third one, we write num3. Let's start by the sum, average, and the product. So since we're working with integers for this problem, so we're going to define everything as integers. So the sum will be an int. So int sum equal num1 plus num2 plus num3. And then for the average, we're going to also introduce it as an integer. So let's call it avg for average. So it's going to be equal to num1 plus num2 plus num3, all divided by 3. For the product, so we're going to define it as an integer as well. So this is equal to num1 multiplied by num2 multiplied by num3. So next, let's find the smallest using if, else if statements. So here find the smallest. So let's introduce an integer and let's call it smallest. So let's start. If num1 is less than or equal than num2 and num1 is less than or equal num3, then the smallest is equal to num1. Else if, now let's assume num2 is the smallest. So if num2 is smaller than or equal than num1 and num2 is less than or equal than num3, then in this case the smallest is num2. For the last case, if the first if is incorrect, num1 is not the smallest, and the second if is incorrect, num2 is not the smallest, then num3 is the smallest. So in this case, we just write else smallest equal num3. So now let's find the largest. So find largest. So let's also introduce a variable of type int and call it the largest. So same idea here. So I'm going to copy paste and do some modification. So we paste it. And then now we're finding the largest. So let's switch this to largest. And then in this case, num1 is greater or equal than num2 and greater or equal than num3. So the largest is num1. Else if num2 is greater or equal than num1 and num2 is greater than or equal than num3. So in this case, the largest is num2. else the largest is num3. So now we want to print those out to the screen. So it says the screen dialog should appear as follows. So to print out the sum, so we're gonna write cout sum is colon space, and then we called it sum. And let's write a new line. To write a new line in between double quotation /n for new line. So next we want to print out the average. So let's copy paste. So instead of sum, we're gonna write average is, we call it avg. So avg. Next line we're gonna print the product. So also copy paste, and then product is, we called it prod. Next we want to print the smallest is, so paste smallest is, we called it smallest. And then lastly we want to print out the largest. So largest is, we called it largest. And then for the main, and then in the main we need return 0 if everything executes without an error. So we type return 0. So that's basically it. So let's run this program and ensure it's working as expected. So we click on local Windows debugger, enter 3 integers. So let's enter 1, 2, and 3. Enter. So this will print out the sum is 6, the average is 2, the product is 6, the smallest is 1, and then the largest is a 3. So everything is working as expected. So let's try it for other 3 integers. So click on run again, and let's enter, now let's put the largest in the middle, and 1. So the sum is 7, the average is 2, it's going to print out an integer, right? And then the product is 8, the smallest is 1, and then the largest is 4. So lastly, I want to show you how you can find the smallest and the largest using the swap method. So let's comment this section here for the smallest and the largest. So to comment a section, you can write a /* and then at the end of what you want to comment, you can write a star and then / again. So we commented this section. To find the smallest and largest using swap method. So when I say the swap method, so I want to sort them always as num1 is less than num2 less than num3. So let's see how we can do this. We're going to use if statement. So first we write if num1 is greater than num2. So what we want to do, we want to swap, and we want to make num1, we want to store the num2 value in num1 and num1 and num2. So in order to do this, let's introduce a temporary variable of type integer, and let's assign it to num1, the greatest. So let me write some comments. So let's assume, take an example, let's assume num1 is 9 and num2 is a 3. So in this case, in this line here, temp became 9 because we assigned it a value of num1. And then next we want to swap. So num1, we want to give it a value of num2. So what we do, we simply write num1 is equal num2. So in this line here, what we did, so num1 became the value of num2, which is a 3. And then lastly, num2, we want to assign it a value of num1, which we stored it in a variable called temp. So let's write num2 equal temp. So in this line here, num2 became 9. So what we did, we swapped the variables. So num1, initially it was, the largest was num1. So what we did, we forced it to be the smallest. We forced num1 to be the smallest of these two, smaller than num2. So we have two more cases. What if num1 is greater than num3? So same idea. First, we want to assign a temporary variable and give it a value of the larger, which is num1 in this case. And next, we want to give num1 the value of num3. So we simply write num1 is equal to num3 to make it the smaller than num3. And then lastly, we want to give num3 the value of num1, which we stored in a temporary variable called temp. We have one more case. If num2 is greater than num3. So first we want to introduce a temporary variable, and we want to give it the value of the larger, which is num2. And now we want to give num2 the value of num3 to make it the smaller one. So num2 equal num3. And then lastly, we want to give num3 the value of num2, but we stored it in a variable called temp. So now we make num3 equal temp. So now we forced this order. We made num1 is the smallest and num3 is the largest. So now in the cout, what we want to do for the smallest is simply it's num1, and then the largest is num3. So let's test it. So run this program, and then let's do 1, 2, 3. So the smallest is 1, the largest is a 3. So let's test it for some other numbers. So let's do 2, 4, and 2. Smallest is 2, largest is 4. So let's do 100, 200, 10. So the smallest is 10, the largest is 200. So this is all for this tutorial. I hope this was helpful. Thanks for watching.
Enjoyed this video? Subscribe to the Computer Engineering Notebook for more tutorials on computer architecture, embedded systems, and hardware design. And hit the bell to catch the next one.